Noff Clipper, hi friends, Darth Momo here, and we're going to talk a bit more about George Lucas and the original expanded universe. For those of you who don't know, I previously made a 6-hour, 40-minute video on the subject, covering it from as many angles and approaches as possible. This video doesn't exist to function as a summary of the original. It's not supplanting it, but supplementing it. As I go on through this video, I will be referencing things I established and pointed out in the last video, so I highly recommend watching that one before watching this. For those of you who think one 6-hour or 6.5-hour long video is too much, I did break it up into chunks based off the section, if that makes it easier. If you really still don't want to watch all 6.5 hours, at the very least, I recommend watching Section 1 regarding George Lucas's statements, Section 2 regarding Lucasfilm statements, and Section 4 regarding the Clone Wars, as well as my little 15-minute clip about Dark Empire. With that, let's get into it. Just to recap, in the first video we established via evidence and case building, George Lucas saw the EU as separate from his canon. Various Lucasfilm and EU personnel also knew that there was a separation. George Lucas made several retcons to the EU with his films. George saw TCW as on par with film canonicity, it was part of his canon, and Dave Filoni is a reliable source when it comes to TCW. George would have completely overhauled the post-Return of the Jedi EU with his sequel trilogy had that version of films been made. George was not as involved in the EU as EU purists like to claim, and canon is dictated, not established. So with that, let's move on. Some might be wondering why I even made this video to begin with. While I initially intended to be done with the EU after the last video and made no further content on it, I've come across a lot of nice little tidbits of information that continue to bolster the case I made in the original video, that George Lucas does not equal the EU. As time went on, I eventually gathered enough information that I thought it would be beneficial to compile that into another video to serve as a supplement to the original. Truthfully, had any of this information been available to me prior to my original video, I would have included it in that. So, our first subject is going to be George Lucas and the Clone Wars. As we evidently proved in the last video, not only did George Lucas actively work on developing stories for the Clone Wars and overseeing its creation, but he also considered TCW to be on par with his films. We also showed why Dave Filoni can actually be trusted when it comes to what he says about TCW and George, and we explained why George sold TCW before it was completely finished and released. But the proof of George's involvement in TCW has continued to reveal itself. I want to point out, though, that in addition to the things I've found on my own while watching videos, a lot of the information about TCW I'm about to present was provided by YouTube user WiseTodd. Below is a screenshot of his icon. He's been in some of my comments about the EU videos, etc. So first, let's start with some quotes from George Lucas himself. To CNN upon receiving a Daytime Emmy for the show in 2013, when asked if he ever thought Star Wars would evolve into animation, George said, "No, but I'm glad it did. We had a great time, we had a lot of fun with it, and you know, it's a passion project for me. I've really enjoyed doing it." Here, he doesn't say TCW is a show made by someone else or Dave Filoni's passion project, especially since in this clip, Dave Filoni is actually standing at his side. George owns TCW 5 seasons into the show on the air as his project that he's been working on. Not worked on in the past tense, but in the present tense. Another criticism I've seen is that George didn't write any scripts or direct episodes, so he wasn't involved like with the movies. Not only did I thoroughly debunk that in the previous video, but here's a quote directly from George about how, he likes to run his productions and how it's very much like a television show, showing George wasn't the traditional person when it came to doing these projects. He had a different mindset and was very involved all over the place. These movies, the Star Wars films, by this time had gotten to be more like television shows. The hierarchy in the way a television show works creatively is very much different than the way it works on a motion picture. The executive producer pretty much is the overall creative overseer of the project and comes up with the ideas for the scripts, and, directors just try to fulfill the obligation of getting it on screen. That was in the 2004 Return of the Jedi DVD commentary. In 2008, to Seth MacFarlane, when asked what he was working on now, George said, "I'm doing the Clone Wars animated TV series. I love television. I've had a great time in television, and I love animation. I've been doing animation for years, and it's combining those two things into something and then being able to tell the story of the Clone Wars, which is sort of the missing link in the features of what actually happened during the Clone Wars, and exploring new characters and have more fun and do it in the style of sort of Episode 4 without the uber reality of the drama of the Skywalker saga. Notice a couple of things here. For one, George says he's doing TCW, not someone else. But on top of that, he describes TCW as what actually happened during the war. If he really saw the Clone Wars multimedia project as canon, then why would he make such a statement? This next quote from Paul Duncan is very interesting. I've seen some people suggest that if Dave Filoni was involved in shaping TCW in an authoritative way, even if it was minuscule, then it is no longer pure George like the movies, and thus it could be put on a lower tier. Yet, that's not exactly how the movies were made. Paul Duncan said in 2021 on Twitter, Lucas has always collaborated. You cannot be a filmmaker without collaborating with hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. How do you measure failure? Lucas may have a different system to you for measuring the success or failure of a project. So that last part was a little bit irrelevant, but Paul Duncan would know better than most, having interviewed George and researched extensively on the behind the scenes for all 6 George Lucas Star Wars saga films. So, if collaboration was always part of the films, and EU purists accept that as Star Wars, then Dave having some sort of involvement in the creative vision of TCW has no bearing on if TCW is part of George's vision or not. Of course, this is also a point I've addressed more thoroughly in the other video. Here's an additional quote from George Lucas regarding the creation of Ahsoka and the bond between Anakin and Obi-Wan from Star Wars Insider 102. We added a new character. We needed to change the dynamic between Obi-Wan and the Mentor and Anakin the Padawan, which is where we left them. That's how they entered the Clone Wars. We wanted to make that relationship become more dynamic, sort of like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They're now equal. They're now partners. They're now working together. But we really wanted to have that Padawan-Mentor relationship, so we gave the most unlikely person a Padawan, which is Anakin, and we made the Padawan a girl. She's very feisty. She is very outgoing and independent-minded, which gives Anakin a real challenge because he's sort of like that too. He's trying to clean up his act by teaching her to settle down and think and not be so aggressive. She's a great character. She's turned out really fantastic. Not only was he, again, as already established in the last video, intimately involved with the way Anakin and Obi-Wan's relationship was portrayed, but he was also intimately involved with Ahsoka's creation, and he had compliments to say about her character and the way she was written. Interesting. I've also got here some more pictures from George from behind-the-scenes involvement. EU purists will typically say George was heavily involved early on and then stepped back. And I've even seen some say most of the BTS images show the same few images of Lucas and they're from the earlier days. Yet here's a picture of him in the writer's room for a Season 5 episode. If you look at what's being written on the plot, it's for the opening arc. And here are 2 images of George overseeing behind-the-scenes animation for the show. The top right is from Mortis in Season 3. And the third image is from Season 3 onwards based off Ahsoka's look. I don't know specifically the episode. So this is not from early on. Adding to that, here's another image of George in the writer's room. If you look at the top of the board, it says 719. The notes reflect an outline that does not resemble any aired Clone Wars episode. This is because this was for one of the later canceled seasons, meaning Lucas was still around when they were working on seasons 7 or 8. Just a little fun side bit. I believe that with the production codes, Siege of Mandalore which was always intended to be the series finale, was episode 721 through 724. So if this is 719 right here, this very likely could be a season 8 episode. All the way at the very end of the show, George was still there working on it. Just shows how far ahead they were and how involved he was from the beginning to the end. Dwayne Dunham, I hope you say his name right, or I said his name right. He had worked with George Lucas on Return of the Jedi as an editor. George invited him to direct a couple episodes of TCW. Here's Dwayne's quote about Season 4, Episode 1 from Star Wars Insider 133. This was in 2012. George said, "Take that dorsal fin off Riff Tamson. He's a man, not a fish." The next thing I said was, "Can he still swim around like this?" And George says, "Of course he can. He's a fish, not a man." Dave and I just burst out laughing. That's just George's way. He changed a lot. I thought that I really had nailed it because I'd paid attention to George when I was working with him on The Jedi. But George kind of tore apart the very first scene in the Senate. It was too talky for him, too much dialogue, and so I watched what he was doing. He sees something and his mind puts it together in a certain way, and he's just absolutely genius at it. The next time I saw it, George had done some intercutting at the beginning when they're trying to almost coordinate the prints where it had been pretty linear. George and the editor, Jason Tucker, had done some intercutting to the beginning when the battle starts, and they wind up at the front lines with Akbar. He just made it less linear, more interesting, and therefore more entertaining. So, interesting, huh? An example that once again confirms that George was not only the author of TCW stories, who pitched them and supervised the process of making scripts, but he was also deeply involved in the visual production. If anything, for example, George also changed the final scene of Season 5, which is, again, a change in the editing room. In 2013, Dave Filoni said this. George and I went over those final scenes quite a bit. One of the big things was the whole scene with the council at the end used to take place outside where Anakin and Ahsoka talk. And it was definitely George, when we watched the first cut of it, who said, I want to split this so that it's half inside, half outside. And the outside is just Anakin and Ahsoka. It was very important to him to separate the two of them out and just have this conversation between them. He wanted kids to know that she didn't blame Anakin for it and that she wasn't upset with Anakin. And a side note before I continue, that ending, that's true what he said, because the actual ending was shot and it's available as a deleted scene on the DVD and Blu-ray. You could see how it was actually originally all outside. The original plan for her 4-part arc in TCW, or Clone Wars Season 5, was to bring her back to the Jedi Order at the end. I said to George, well, that would be what we normally do. What if we keep her expelled and see where it goes? Luckily, he agreed. That last quote is quite relevant, too. EU purists often claim Dave went against George's wishes on Ahsoka's fate. Not only is that demonstrably not true, but I thoroughly debunked that in the last video, and this quote just further confirms that. In 2016, Filoni actually said that George ultimately decided to keep Ahsoka alive, at least until a possible confrontation with Vader. This is something that George Lucas and I talked about. When Order 66 is called and Ahsoka survives it, she has a moment where she reaches out into the Force and she looks for Anakin's presence. The conversation I had with George about Ahsoka was mainly pertaining to Vader and what she would know and what she wouldn't know, because it was George's feeling that she survived Order 66. So I made sure to discuss with him his feelings on that, and then I've made choices since then. But her being a fulcrum-like agent, a part of building this rebellion and stuff, was never something we really discussed in detail. So, even if George possibly wanted her to die at Vader's hand later, instead of making her join the rebellion, and Filoni didn't execute that in Rebels, that still has nothing to do with the Clone Wars. Even the ending of Season 7 shows only that Ahsoka survived Order 66 and nothing more, which doesn't contradict the quote above about George's decision. Everything post-Order 66 was pitched and made without him, but that has no bearing on TCW as its own entity. So here's another quote from Dave Filoni I've seen EU purists try to use to say George stepped away from TCW. When asked, how much regular input does George have? Is he still in all the writing meetings, pitching stories? Dave responded, he's letting go to a certain degree, but I always go over all the stories with him. He comes in and watches all the color final with me, but I have a lot of oversight over the whole thing. Christian and I have been handling the writing in a major way. That's the whole purpose of us. George entrusts us with this project, and we make it the way that he taught me. We fly a bit more on our own now, but any question that I have, I can always just drop him a line. It's not difficult at all to get a hold of him. Like I said, it's always his universe. It's not that difficult to stay in keeping with what he wants. The filmmaker's logic that we've learned and we apply, it works on the show. Honestly, I don't see how this can imply George stepped away. He got a little less involved, but Dave still goes on to describe how involved George still was and how he approves the whole thing and he's still working with him on the stories. Never does Dave say George completely stepped away from TCW. And we've got later quotes, because this one's from 2011. We've got later quotes showing that they're still working on the stories together. Anyone trying to use this quote to bolster the narrative George stepped away from TCW just shoots themselves in the foot. I've also seen some EU purists use this next quote from Ron Moore, who worked on Star Wars Underworld, to describe George's involvement in this, and imply that came at Clone Wars' loss. We go to gather at Skywalker Ranch periodically every couple of months, and break stories and write scripts for this proposed series that George was interested in. And George was in the ring with us every day, and it was fascinating, amazing experience. First off, it's a 2014 quote, and it's convenient how EU purists will discard post-buyout quotes that are post-October 2012 that go against their narrative, but they'll allow it when it supports the narrative they're trying to build. Anyway, All he said here was they meet every couple of months. We've already established in both videos that it takes a week or two to write all the Clone Wars stories. And then George checked in every week or so and approved things. I don't see how this quote means he couldn't do both Clone Wars and Underworld, especially if they're just writing stories. It was a 2-week process for Clone Wars for an entire season, so how long was it to do for Underworld? Ron Moore never says. It's not like this has taken years to do. Years at a time, I should say. So, especially since, in the last video too, I showed a quote where George talked about working on Clone Wars, Red Tails, and Underworld simultaneously. And that would have also been at the same time when he was working on Indiana Jones 4. So, this quote is, like so many others, a nothing burger. Another one, the inhibitor chips. They were, in Clone Wars Season 6, a very big controversy to EU fans. In fact, I've had a few come after me about this issue. Yet, the inhibitor chips weren't a Filoni creation, they came from Lucas. Here's a good hint at it. In 2010 to IGN, he said, obviously, the clones play a very big role in the series, and we really enjoy turning them into personalities and seeing war from their side, seeing what their problems are, the issues of how were they programmed, and when they were programmed. That sort of thing will eventually reveal itself, not in Season 3, so be sure to watch Season 4 or 5 or 6. Notice this is in 2010. So you might think, oh, well, we don't know that he's referring to the chips. Those are from Season 6. And 2010 saw the release of Season 3. Well, we already know how fast ahead they were, considering the show was canceled after Season 5 aired, and they were already working on the end of the show. We also know, and I'll show this quote later, that in 2012, shortly before the buyout, the writer Christian Taylor had already said that he had written an episode or episodes for Season 6. So we already know what Lucas is conceptually thinking about here. But notice here how he says, the issue of how they were programmed and when they were programmed. That will reveal itself eventually. Could be all the way in Season 6. Wonder what he's hinting at there, huh? George was behind the inhibitor chips. Undoubtedly. It's also confirmed by Dave Filoni in the IGN interview in 2014. George was inspired by the film The Manchurian Candidate, which featured hypnotic brainwashing for the purpose of cold-blooded murder. Then, in 2004, the remake of that film came out, which featured the implants similar to the inhibitor chips. Lucas saw the remake and decided to add the chips in TCW. Filoni mentioned that film in the IGN interview on Season 6. After all, George is a film guy. He loves referencing films. And this is something that YouTuber Rick Worley extensively demonstrates in his video series on the George Lucas Star Wars films. Dave's quote from 2014 to IGN is, "From my earliest conversations with George coming onto Clone Wars, as far back as 2005 when I put to him what was Order 66 and how did it work, he was always connected to the idea that it was somewhat of a Manchurian Candidate concept. When the Order goes down, it's not like the clones have a real way to say, no, I'm not going to do this. And notice, like I said, the remake of Manchurian Candidate that has the implant similar to the inhibitor chips came out in 2004. And George and Dave Filoni were talking about this as far back as 2005. Considering Dave Filoni was such a big Star Wars fan before joining Lucasfilm, and he joined around the time of Revenge of the Sith, it makes sense he would ask a question like that early on, as well as probably asking other questions. Dave also said at, and there's the link, by the way, if anyone wants that. Dave also said at Celebration Orlando in 2012, George is with us every step of the way. And that was while he was sitting right next to George. George never denied it during their entire conversation. I actually encourage everyone to watch the clip. Here's the link to it. It's about 10 minutes long, and it gives great insight into George and Dave in the Clone Wars. Brent Friedman, a writer on TCW, had the following to say in 2014. The stories themselves were pretty much generated by primarily George, to a certain extent Dave, and then Carrie and the head writer. And at any time we were making changes, George, as you can imagine, had the final say-so. So once he agreed to something and liked it, and it fit with what his vision was, then, we would move on. When I got the script back with George's notes, he had almost no notes, and he had written on the title page, "Great. Dave Filoni is a director and certainly was the primary creative force behind Clone Wars, beneath George." He sheds light on a few things here. For one, George primarily creates the stories, not everyone else. George makes changes. Dave is beneath George. I think another good one is him describing George writing notes on scripts. This was in Season 5. So as far as Season 5, George was reading the scripts and approving them. And we already talked about in the last video how that was described by several people as the process earlier on. In 2012, this is the guy I talked about earlier, Christian Taylor, a writer on TCW, had the following to say. Because when George was talking about the Mortis trilogy in the writer's room, the thing that's fantastic about this show is that we spend so much time with George. Because we were 3 years ahead of you guys, like we've already written season 6, so it was the first and probably I wrote the last ones, which I can't obviously talk about, but they're Mortis-esque. I wouldn't say I avoid writing the EU, because that's not it. I would love to do more of the expanded universe stuff. It's just that I think the reason I've succeeded, I think in the context of George and on the Clone Wars, is because I don't know all that stuff. I just go work purely from the movies and from Clone Wars, the series. You go up with George, and you're working for 10 days, and you have to come up with 22 stories. So he continues to point out how involved George Lucas is. He also says how they take 10 days or so to plan out the stories for the whole season. EU purists have brought up how sometimes George or Dave allude to being there for a couple of weeks in the year, but that's still not enough time for them to come up with all the stories. That's what their general process was. The quote about Season 6, though, is interesting. This was in August 2012, as I've already mentioned. He is clearly talking about Season 6 and the Yoda episodes, and they were already written prior to the buyout, meaning George had approved everything in the Yoda episodes. More. George was the showrunner. He had the final say on everything from story to final cut. That was Brent Friedman. George is the alpha and the omega and is involved in the story from beginning to end. On the Clone Wars, that means from the initial story idea until the final sound mix. I knew from the moment I got the job that was going to be George's show. My job was to execute his vision, and I've always tried my best to do that. That's Henry Gilroy. Again, just more proof of George's involvement in TCW. And here are some more comments about George's influence on character designs. George will often send us a design and say, I want it to look something like this. Then we have to take it and bring it into the Clone Wars world. And sometimes it changes a lot and sometimes it doesn't. This was another design that came to us from George. He is basically a big suit of armor and George wanted this little guy inside him. And Embo was a design handed to us by George from earlier concept work. We just modified him a bit. Lucas did not like the creature's head in the initial sketch, so Filoni covered it with a post-it note and drew a second face that Lucas approved. For Raxus, the capital world of the Separatists, George wanted us to think of the capital as a land of perpetual autumn, a place of beauty as opposed to the obvious bad guy's homeworld idea. I started off with Ahsoka being a little tentative, feeling her way along, but George really wanted her to have a bombastic personality. We met in the middle. Carrie Silver said, when asked how hands-on George Lucas was, far more than anybody realizes. He's very involved in the crafting of the stories and the whole script process. He's also involved throughout the production in terms of seeing artwork, providing reference, ideas, and concepts for designs. He personally goes through every episode in the production phase as well as the final edits of the episodes once they're in full color. George has his own ideas about where the show should go and where it should be, and that pushes us into directions unknown. Again, George was driving the show, and he was involved. In 2020, Keith Kellogg said he would be involved in all the aspects from the script stage all the way up to our final story reel before we sent it overseas to really be produced and animated. Then he would give us notes once he saw the final rendered version. At Rebel ScumCon in 2025, Matt Wood and Sam Witwer talked about TCW. It's interesting because EU purists will use Sam as a source when trying to make the case for Force Unleashed. A prominent EU YouTuber even used a clip of Sam from this very event for that purpose. Now, since EU purists value Sam Witwer's stance on Force Unleashed, let's see what he and Matt Wood bring to the table on the TCW, especially since Matt Wood worked on the prequels with George. When asked what his favorite part of working on the Clone Wars was, Sam Witwer said, I'm going to throw it to Matt Wood, and I'm going to say, wasn't it absolutely how much fun George was having with the Star Wars universe? Matt Wood commented, yeah, I mean, so when we finished Sith, Revenge of the Sith, we were having this screening, and it went really well, and George was very happy. He seemed like, he's told the story that he wants to tell, and detected a certain lightness in him, and he was like, looking forward to telling some other stories and getting it we finished the prequels together, and he was very happy. And I got maybe a month after that, I got brought into this room, and it was actually Rick McCallum was part of it at this point. And he said, George was like, hey, Matt, we want to do another animation series. We like the Jenny Tartakovsky thing. That was an experiment to see if there was an appetite for the Clone Wars stories, which there was. And he said, we want to do 8 episodes of this thing. We're going to internally produce it. We're going to make this Clone Wars series in 8 episodes. And then the producer at the time, Rick, was like, thinking that we were all sick of Star Wars. And he was like, you don't have to. I'm only going to ask you to do 8. And George, you only have to do 8. We're just going to do 8 episodes, and we're going to hand it off to another team. You guys could do other things. You don't have to do it. And I was like, I like working on Star Wars. But anyway, so we did these 8 episodes, and Dave Filoni had come up from, I think he was coming right in from Nickelodeon, I believe. I can't remember exactly where he came in straight from, but he knocked on my door. He just knew. He went to the tech building and found my name on the door, and he knocked on it, and he was like, I saw your documentary that you made. It was about Attack of the Clones. We were recording on the Jedi transport ships and everything. And he said, I've got this little sequence we're working on. It's a cliff sequence, and we just want to, if it's like 10 minutes long, could you do some sound for it? And sure, of course. And we did the sound. And then if you cut to that, what was like, how many years later? We did 100 plus episodes. George worked on every single one. I worked on every single one. I mean, we loved it. George could do most of the work in post-production. He had a great writing team. It was a very small crew. We couldn't say anything. We were even making the show for like 2 years or something. What are you working on? I was just like, couldn't say it to anybody. We couldn't tell anybody. Sam Witwer chimed in. We didn't even know about it over in Force Unleashed. We had no idea. Matt continued, completely nobody. And then because George really likes to make the show, completely finish it on his own terms, done and then sell it, yeah, it was like we made 2 seasons. I think we had 2 seasons worth of material before we even announced that we had made the show at all. Unbelievable. Completely working in secret. And then, yeah, it did end up going on Cartoon Network. And then, yeah, we did it. We took the first 4 episodes and we put it in the movie theater, which was funny because at the time I was also working on Wall-E and George wanted, and I was having to kind of moonlight. I work with a lot of artists, and I'm like, if I'm working on one show and I've got another show, I want each artist to feel like I'm the number one person for both of those shows. So I was juggling Wall-E and Clone Wars at the same time. And then George may have had this idea where he's like, hey, you know what? I want to make the first 4 episodes, I want to make it into a movie. And we're like, okay, wow, because it wasn't supposed to be. So we kind of took those together, cut it together. And he goes, the guys from Pixar want to come over and show us Wall-E, and I thought we could do a little bake-off with them and we could show them a Clone Wars movie. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's a great idea. I think that's good. We should get those Wall-E guys over here to show them the movie. So then I remember when they came in, I just stayed sitting in the room, and I was like, what the? And the credits were all done, and it was like supervising sound editor Matt Wood, you know, and George was like, oh, you did that one too, huh? And I'm like, yeah, but he's totally fine. But it was a good day. Well, here you have it, folks. According to someone who worked on the prequels with TCW with George, or prequels and TCW with George Lucas worked on every single episode of the Clone Wars. Here's a 2012 quote from Dave Filoni on George and the Clone Wars in the EU. George does read the comics, and I think the Clone Wars comics catch his eye because obviously he's working on the Clone Wars. He also recognized Henry Gilroy's name as the writer of the comic. We needed some stories to round out a season, and George said, we have a couple of stories here, let's think of adapting them. Henry had already written for the show, which made a real difference there. We called Henry and he decided to come back and work with us again. We had made a lot of tweaks to it though. Ahsoka is older now than she was in the original comic book. Ventress is no longer working for the Separatists in our timeline. It was fun adapting with Henry and Stephen Merching what Henry had done and bringing it into the world of Star Wars movie experience from the comic book page. There's no more clear illustration of the difference between the expanded universe and the Star Wars created by George Lucas. The EU is a well of ideas, and then there's what's on screen. They don't live in the same universe. Everyone wants to think so. I know, and there's a lot of effort to make it all work, but it's pretty clear when you start really looking at it that when you take ideas from the printed realm and bring it on the screen, it's not always the same. They relate, there are similarities. I still enjoy a lot of those stories. I think there are a lot of great ideas. They influence you, they inspire you, which I think is the whole point of having an EU. We try hard to honor things when we can to give nods to things, but at the end of the day, there's a difference between what you see in the Star Wars films and TV series and what you see in those books. Now, some EU purists might try and say this means George took from the EU. Well, first off, it means George was involved in TCW, but second, he always was open to inspiration from the EU. I talked about that a lot in the first video. But he never saw it as canon, which we've discussed at length already. He just saw it as a wellspring of ideas, just as Filoni has said, and several others have commented as well. Here's a link to all the TCW-related interviews from Star Wars Insider issues, because I know that those could be a bit difficult to access. This is for anyone who wants to do their own digging. I think I've provided more than sufficient evidence between all the videos on the EU and TCW that I've made, but if you want to dig further, you're more than welcome to do so. Also, if you're interested in Filoni's interviews, here are a few, since I already proved in the last video that Dave Filoni is absolutely a reliable source and not a liar like some EU fans claim. I'll leave that up for a second. But, moving on. Let's readdress the argument regarding prequel hate and its influence on George Lucas and TCW. It's been argued by EU purists that George was influenced by prequel hate on TCW, so it's not his true vision, and thus can be discarded regardless of what his involvement may have been. And that's not true. I already debunked this theory in my earlier video. Not only was George not compromised by prequel hate on TCW, but there are instances where his vision was compromised on the prequels due to audience backlash. Or I shouldn't say compromised, but changed. Yet most EU purists don't discard the films. But there's more evidence further supporting the idea that TCW was not influenced by prequel hate. When asked about fan pressure ahead of The Phantom Menace, George said, "Pressure is, not that great, actually. I know the really high expectations of some of the fans and everything I can't possibly meet, so I simply don't worry about it because there's nothing I can do about it. Once you get your expectations so high, there's no way you can meet them." When asked about the plot setup and the setting of the story upon the beginning of the film, George said, "Well, most people will find it confusing, but basically what it says is that there's a planet, the bad guys have surrounded it, and then when asked why, George pauses and says, we don't know why. It doesn't make any difference. They're bad guys, that's all you need to know." This was in an interview with The Big Breakfast in 1999. I think it's pretty clear here, not only did George Lucas expect some backlash for Phantom Menace, not as much as it received, but he also wasn't concerned about letting others' opinions getting to him. Here's another one from 1999. "I think you have to have a thick enough skin to cope with the criticism. I'm very self-critical. I've a lot of friends that I trust and who are film directors and writers and people in my profession, and I trust them to be extremely critical, but I trust their opinion, and their opinion is thoughtful knowledge, and I also know them personally, so I know the psychological slant they're putting on it. I know what their tastes are, and I could say, well, that's great for them and not for me, because most criticism when it comes to movies, there's technical criticism, which is extremely helpful, but you're only going to really get that from your peers. I've discovered that most critics themselves are cinematically illiterate." Does that sound like a man who's going to cave into pressure? I think not. He mentions here about, he's very self-critical and he listens to criticism from his friends and etc. And it's very possible that he's willing to change some things based off his own personal criticism and criticism from trusted friends and colleagues. But this doesn't sound like someone who's going to cave from audience backlash. If Steven Spielberg came up to him and was like, well, actually, I think you should do that a little differently. George might not change, but, he might at least consider, and maybe he changed that. And George is very critical of himself. He might look back and go, actually, I don't really like how that turned out. I want to do that differently. So if people really perceive some differences in Clone Wars, that doesn't mean it's because of audience backlash. That could mean that's George being critical due to his own personal criticism that he puts on himself. So another one he says here in 2002, this is with Robin Williams, "It sort of got exaggerated with the fandom because the audience grew up, and so what they loved when they were 10 years old, they definitely didn't like when they were like 30. They expected it sort of, to have that same reaction, and they couldn't, it's still for 10-year-olds, so it's like, the 10-year-olds love Jar Jar Binks, that it's a huge character, and the only people that really don't like it are some of the hardcore fans and the media. The media hates it." He acknowledges the backlash here, but does it seem like someone who's going to cave on his whole decades in the making vision over it? Nope. 2005. "Irony upon irony is mostly what I do is write. For God's sake, I'm someone who hates writing, hates to develop character, hates to do dialogue." This sounds like someone who's willing to acknowledge potential weak spots in the prequels and willing to use TCW as a way to flesh things out further or rework some things he didn't like about the prequels, as I've argued before. But it does not sound like someone who's critical of his own work because of what others say, but rather what he personally thinks, which is very much in line with George Lucas and what we know about him. If George was really so immune to the prequel backlash throughout the 6 years of their release too, why would he suddenly do a 180 after 30 years of not caring about backlash and suddenly craft a whole show and change everything just to accommodate backlash? If George really was someone to bend the knee to prequel hate and compromise his entire vision, we would see that in episodes 2 and 3 as well, not just the Clone Wars. To drive the point home, though, here's George in 2025 at Comic-Con, where he again shows he is not the kind of person to bend the knee to something like the prequel backlash. I discovered, just from my experience from making movies and things, that other people's opinions don't mean much. The only thing that really means something is what you do and what you feel about it, and then if you see that other people react to it in a very emotional way, then you say, well, I did my job. That was good. To further elaborate, if TCW was really a response to prequel hate, then why was the show not targeted towards 30 or 40-year-olds, the demographic that prequel-hating original trilogy fans would have been? The show wasn't even targeted arguably towards the age graphic that prequel fans were. It was targeted towards the next generation. But prequel fans would have been a lot closer to the target demographic than the original trilogy fans were. Also, if this was a response to prequel hate, why was Jar Jar an active focus in 11 episodes of TCW? 4 of those being episodes in the debut season. Jar Jar was the most hated aspect of the prequels. So why would 4 episodes of the first season put an active focus on the character? Why also were several episodes of the show political episodes? Why was politics in the show at all? Politics in the prequels were heavily criticized, yet TCW devotes entire episodes to them. If it was a response to prequel backlash, the politics would be nowhere near the Clone Wars show. We saw what removing politics because of prequel backlash looks like. That was The Force Awakens. And the prequels and the TCW resemble nothing like The Force Awakens. Moving on, I want to briefly address some new evidence that touches on the George Lucas sequel trilogy treatments. We've talked about before how George Lucas' sequel trilogy treatments retcon the EU in several fashions. I've seen some people say those should be discarded from the debate, one of the reasons being George said he never intended to do sequels. This quote is often circulated. The sequels were never really going to get made anyway, unlike 1, 2, and 3, where the stories have existed for 20 years. The idea of 7, 8, 9 actually came from people asking about sequels, and I said, I don't know, maybe someday. Then when the licensing people came and asked, can we do novels, I said, do sequels, because I'll probably never do sequels. However, just because he didn't initially intend to do sequels, or said he was going to do, but later decided not to, it doesn't mean we can't just discard what he did because he actually started working on them. Initially, he said he would do prequels, then decided for about a decade that he wouldn't. This doesn't make the prequels any less valid. When asked by David Letterman in 1983 if there was going to be another Star Wars, Carey said, I don't think so. Han and I sort of choosing what planet to live on and having a child that grows up with hair like that and so forth. No, I think they were considering doing the prequels 1, 2, and 3, and I don't know that they're going to do that now. I think Mr. Lucas is very tired. This shows that, yes, there was a time where he was done with Star Wars and had no intentions to do the prequels, yet he later changed his mind. And if he did that with the prequels, he could do that with the sequels. So let's move on to George and actual EU stories. Dark Empire, one of the earliest EU stories, was explained by Lucy Autry Wilson in 2022 to be an EU story that had no Lucas involvement and was a reason he started keeping some light tabs on the EU. EU purists recognize the damage that this does to the narrative, so they try to bring up earlier accounts from Dark Empire writer Tom Veitch that seem to suggest Lucas actually did pitch the story of Dark Empire, not Lucy. I've seen this one flare up a bit after releasing my video. So, what's the truth? Did George Lucas suggest cloning Palpatine? Depends on who you ask. According to Dark Empire creator Tom Veitch in 1992, it was Lucy Wilson's idea. And I've got the images on the next slide I'll show you in a second. Lucy Wilson would later corroborate this account in 2022. So why do people think it was George Lucas's idea? Well, in 2003 and 2007, Tom changed the narrative. He now attributed the idea to Lucas and Lucas alone. So what happened? Was he lying? Probably not. According to Wilson, in 2022, Lucas wasn't happy with Palpatine being cloned and requested things be approved by him in the future. Tom later worked on Tales of the Jedi in 1995, where he sent memos to Lucas for story approval. Most likely he assumed, based off Lucas's minor involvement here, that this meant Lucas was the one responsible for the story development for Dark Empire, when it was Lucy Wilson. Lucas's only involvement with Dark Empire was he approved a new post-Return of the Jedi comic story. At the time the comic was proposed, the story was not yet set in stone. In fact, after Lucas approved doing a comic, Tom said his first idea was to tell a Vader-Anakin prequel story, but Lucy rejected that. So, if that was his only conversation with Lucas, then the Palpatine thing didn't come up then, because otherwise Tom would not have pitched his original idea. Some have tried to say Lucas was pleased with Dark Empire afterwards and even gave it out as Christmas gifts, so that means he either approved Palpatine being cloned or liked it at the very least. That's not necessarily the case. According to Ian McDiarmid, George told Ian on set for Return of the Jedi that the Emperor was for sure dead. In 2008, Lucas again emphasized the Emperor wasn't cloned in his mind. I've shown both those quotes in the Dark Empire section from the last video. Besides, George could still like the plot in general without liking the Emperor's return. But there's more to the story. Lucas loves art. He has bought EU books for Christmas gifts at other points in time, but they were never EU novels. It was always comic books, or in one instance, the EU Illustrated Star Wars universe, full of Ralph McQuarrie's art. Lucas is opening a museum dedicated to art now. He even bought artwork from the 2015 Marvel Comics Star Wars run, and I showed that in the last video. Most likely his praise of Dark Empire had more to do with the artwork than the story, or more specifically, the Emperor's return. But I told you I'd give you the quotes. Here we go. The quote is right here. His quote in 2003 is, "George Lucas told me personally that he loved it. Some people had a problem with the bringing back of the Emperor, but as I have explained elsewhere, we did that under George Lucas's direction. Originally, we asked him if we could bring back Darth Vader, assuming that the Empire would want to perpetuate the image of Vader in order to strike fear into the hearts of billions. So they would put somebody else inside the Vader costume, of course. But George nixed that idea and told us we could bring back the Emperor." His 2007 quote reads right here, "I love that George Lucas gave us carte blanche to think up new ideas and stories. The first idea we gave him, this was back in 1989, you understand, was that the Empire had preserved Vader's costume or a duplicate of it, and that they would put somebody else inside it, so that Darth Vader could continue to inspire fear and obedience among the far-flung worlds of the galaxy. George said no to that. Our second idea was that the Emperor should continue to live through the process of cloning. George said yes to that." Interesting to note, before I read these other ones, that for those who hold Tom Veitch in such high regard, that in this second paragraph right here, and you can go on and pause it and read it, he actually goes on to diss the prequel, saying Lucas dropped the ball. In 1992, from Star Wars Insider 16, Tom said, and the quote is right here, "Those who have read issue number 2 of Dark Empire were probably extremely surprised at the events of taking place within. At the outset of the project, Veitch and Kennedy wanted to bring back Darth Vader. According to Veitch, Lucy Wilson said to us, 'You can't bring back Vader, but if you can bring back the Emperor, if you could figure out how to do it.' So there, as I've already explained, we have contradictory statements by Tom Veitch. It wasn't Lucy Autry Wilson who changed the narrative, but rather Tom Veitch. This statement right here from 1992 contradicts his later accounts. Considering the other quotes by Ian McDiarmid and Lucas about Palpatine's fate, I think Lucy's story is clearly the correct one, not Tom's later account, but Tom's first account." Speaking of George Lucas and the EU, let's talk about Shadows of the Empire. A lot of EU purists like to point out to the Outrider being included in the A New Hope Special Edition as an example of George viewing the EU as canon. In my first video, I made an educated guess that EU fans were looking too deep into it and suggested that based off the timeline of the Special Edition work, either the Outrider first was made for the Special Editions, or its inclusion was simply a time and money-saving strategy. EU purists slammed my comment as outright false, correctly pointing out that Doug Chiang designed the ship for Shadows of the Empire. However, then they made the leap in logic to conclude its inclusion as an EU original element meant Lucas saw the EU as canon. They'll point out how John Knoles, an associate at LucasArts, recounts that Lucas had the Outrider included in the special edition of A New Hope. However, let's look at what John Knoles actually had to say. When asked if it felt good to see the Outrider in Star Wars A New Hope, John said, "Well, yeah, and it was all kind of about the burgeoning cooperation between ILM and LucasArts at the time. At the time, we were put all under one company, Lucas Digital or something, and we were asked to try and collaborate more, which was tough. Those guys make movies, we make games. But we did have some moments of close collaboration. That was one of them. They were like, hey, we need some ships to put in the sky. We hear you guys have some amazing ship library from all these games you make. What do you got?" And so we sent them a few of we had a better version of the Shuttle Tyridium than they did, actually, and we sent them the Outrider, and they chucked that in the scene, and we take models from them and make them into game vehicles if we could, and on Racer there was a lot of collaboration between they were trying to figure out the physics of how these things would actually work, and we were trying to figure out way ahead of them, so the way we had tackled some of those things informed how they approached them in the movie. Which is also interesting because EU YouTuber Scruffy-looking Nerf Herder actually tries to say that the similarities between the pod racers in the game and the movie actually are an instance of the EU inspiring the films, but in reality, it again was just close collaboration between them on trying to get the graphics of it all to work. Clearly, It was nothing more than a money and time-saving strategy effort. It had nothing to do with including it because it was canon. The decision was not directly from George, rather a higher-up decision that led to the ILM guys picking up what ships to use. Anyone thinking there's more to it than resource conservation is reading too deep into it. Just for fun, though, in that 2024 material same interview, John Knoles had some other interesting stuff to say about Star Wars, the EU, the franchise under Disney, and his time at LucasArts. Referring to the beginning of Lucas Games, he said, "We were sort of forbidden from working on Star Wars." That was sort of George Lucas's mantra. He was like, "I make Star Wars, you guys go make your own thing, then that'll make me a lot of money so I can go make movies." Lucas clearly didn't like other people touching his IP, which would explain why, according to both Lucas and Howard Rothman, as I explained in the other video, Lucas decided to make the EU an alternate canon when he allowed its creation. When asked, did George have much to do with the direction of the games in general? Like, did you need to run stuff past him? What kind of interactions would you have with George Lucas? John said, not much. In the early days, I think as the prequels, or as we on the inside call it, the dark times, there was a lot more care in making sure we were being consistent with what has not yet been released on film. So for a long time, we just kind of understood that the films on the radio show were canon, nothing else was. The novels were sort of second in line in terms of almost canon, and the comics were out in like crazy land, like Luke was in love with some random space bunny person, and I mean, there was a time when those comics just went off the rails, and so we really didn't look at those, and so it was kind of a responsibility we took on ourselves to do it with authenticity because of our love of Star Wars and wanting to do it right. For anyone who thinks George was deeply involved in the EU, this quote, in addition to others I provided in the last video, might make you think twice. If anything, actually, they took continuity on themselves. It wasn't necessarily a Lucas-mandated thing. We were going to do the Darth Vader game, and it became the Episode 3 game because the Darth Vader game, or the Darth Vader Kicks Butt game, is not a game that fit George Lucas's idea of what Darth Vader was. He was a weakling who made a mistake, and that's why we had Darth Vader. It's not because he celebrated, etc. You can read the word fill in the blank there. You can make that game, but you can't tie it to my movie because that's not what my movie's about. I'm telling a tragedy. If George was so willing to let them make a random game with Vader and do whatever, since he just wouldn't consider it canon, how many other projects did this logic extend to? Some EU purists have said if George didn't like an EU story, like Darth Empire, for example, he would simply have it removed from the canon. But as we see with this example, that wasn't exactly how Lucas operated. He was content with letting this stuff exist as something separate. Just for fun, though, let's keep going. Most of these I just included because I know EU purists won't like it. Whatever extended universe stuff, which I included that because I know EU fans get touchy about the name and hate it being called the extended universe. John also said, like The Mandalorian is in a lot of ways far more interesting than Boba Fett or Jango Fett. He threw some shade at Shadows of the Empire as well, saying, in fact, She-Shore is the worst example of a Star Wars name ever. I don't really want to get into how that name came to be, but it's not really Star Wars-y. He also commented on the prequel saying, we knew the hype. We also knew that we were starting to see the whole film come together, and it was hard to, how it turned out. It was hard to go through all that knowing they don't know this, but there's going to be a backlash coming. And it's going to make a bunch of money. And it's going to be really cool and great for lots of reasons, but it's just missing, some basic storytelling awesomeness that was in the original trilogy that was pretty clear to see. He also praised Solo, saying, in the Han Solo movie, by the way, I absolutely love that. I don't know why everybody gave that a bad rap. It was everything I wanted from a Han Solo movie. And of course, he enjoys The Mandalorian. I think The Mandalorian definitely tugs on the nostalgia strings. It is the most enjoyable Star Wars experience I think I've had since seeing Empire Strikes Back. This last one is interesting, though. When asked, do you see a lot of that EU element, or that stuff, the EU elements, when you're watching the newer films? John said, well, I certainly see it, but I don't see that there was a direct line to it. I think these are all things that the filmmakers now, or as we as game makers then, are like, wow, there's an interesting story there that nobody's really told. Which is interesting since some EU purists claim Disney is just stealing from the EU deliberately. But someone on the inside of the EU, like John Knoles, doesn't see that. I've also got a few more quotes from EU personnel about George and the EU. In 2015, when asked what his thoughts were on the old EU books that were no longer canon now that Disney took over, author Steve Perry said, oh, they never were. Nothing was ever canon other than the movies. That was in a YouTube interview with Ritual Mystery. And then in the 2022 interview we've talked about so much in the last, or both this video and the last one, Lucy Autry Wilson, who again was very involved with the EU development, said, our expanded universe books and comics were never intended to be canon. Only what George wrote was canon. We tried to keep an internal consistency so our writers did not contradict anything George had created or anything any of our other writers had added. In the beginning, George was not very involved. He had given me and my group the freedom to develop stories in the future so as not to compete with what he planned to do in the past. These quotes speak for themselves. As I've already pointed out in the last video, Lucy again reiterates that the decision to maintain continuity was not a Lucas decision, but Lucy and her partners, Sue Rustoni and Howard Rothman, were the ones who made that decision. Also, for anyone who tries to say, oh, well, these are post-buyout quotes, so, Disney influenced them or whatever, neither of these authors have worked under the Disney acquisition. Steve Perry hasn't done any work since, I don't believe, Shadows of the Empire. And Lucy Autry Wilson left, I believe, in 2010. So both pre-Disney. They have nothing to gain here. And then moving on to some additional debunkings. I've got two quotes from Star Wars Insider 26 that I've seen EU purists try to use to argue that Lucas saw the EU as part of the true canon. The first one seems to just be a generic statement from the magazine. The Lucasfilm licensing team presented a comprehensive key marketing timeline and marketing strategy by a voracious group of licensing professionals at the annual New York International Licensing Show. Our message emphasized the long-term commitment to the integrity of the property. Lucasfilm's strategy intricately links back to the desires and cravings of the true Star Wars fans, rather than the blind commercialism becoming prevalent in the world of entertainment merchandising today. Again, this only reinforces what I've been saying in both videos. Continuity was an internal Lucasfilm licensing strategy, not a George Lucas requirement. There was nothing here that required them to do it. They chose to do it to rise above the commercialism that was growing more and more prevalent, and we still see in today's world. The second quote is from an interview in the magazine with author Kevin J. Anderson. When asked, is there any history Lucasfilm won't let you explore in the books? He said, we can't talk about the times immediately before the first three movies, like the Clone Wars, for example. We can't talk about Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader and Luke and Leia's mother because those are obviously very tightly held secrets. If you do stuff with that, even if Lucasfilm would approve it, that's just asking to be contradicted when the new movies come out. There are plenty of other things in the galaxy to be writing about. The EU purists have tried to argue with this quote that if they weren't all on the same canon, this wouldn't have been an issue. Therefore, EU is canon to George. But I disagree. Kevin literally said writing in the prequel era was just asking to be contradicted. If it was true canon, there would be no real threat of contradiction. Small, minor, tiny details, possibly, but not outright overridden. I've made this point before, but it's nice to have an actual quote supporting this. Forbidding the EU authors to write in the prequel era wasn't for George's sake. It was for the sake of the EU. These guys worked hard. George respected that. He wasn't a jerk. He didn't want to steamroll right over them, but he would if he needed to, which all the EU authors understood, and he did so several times with the prequels, like I explained in the last video. Moving on to more about the EU. I've also had a YouTube user, Mike Nayers, point out how the EU used to be featured on StarWars.com in their databank section until around 2002 when everything not part of the first 4 released Star Wars films was pulled from the website. I've seen images before this in YouTube videos from other users, but I can't find any images of it on my own. And to that, I ask, if the EU was truly canon to Lucas, why would he either order or allow the official Star Wars website to remove the EU-related entries from the website? To close out, I just want to say I've been grateful for this whole experience. Prior to engaging with the EU crowd, there was so little I actually knew on this subject. And the more I've engaged, the more I've researched, and the more I've learned. The EU really was nothing more than a wellspring of ideas to take inspiration from. It served a purpose for sure, but it's not the same as the Lucas saga, the 6 films, and the Clone Wars. I've wholeheartedly loved learning what I've learned about Lucas and these projects, and it's only reinforced to me how clearly the Clone Wars was George's vision for Star Wars. The evidence has only continued to support that notion. I hope the over 7 hours worth of content I've produced on the matter has served its purpose and enlightened and educated those diligently seeking the truth on the matter. Until next time, may the Force be with you. Always. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them a delight.